folks. Thank you all for coming, and I think there are more chairs for those who have just come in, or have we run out? Are there any empty seats around? If you have a seat near you, if you could keep your hand up. There are some seats in the front. It's always a good problem to have. You sure you want to sit on the floor? Okay. Okay. Yeah. We need a different one, probably. I'll talk loudly. How about that? Okay. I am sorry that we missed the month of March. I had a little trouble with my feet. That's better now, so I can come and do these things. While we have not had a meeting, I have still been pretty busy. And I thought I'd mention it for those of you that don't know it anyway, because it's not just about my good fortune, but also it is a sign of something that I think you will be interested to hear. In February, I was invited to go and be interviewed by Bill Moyers on his television program, which I did. The response to that was so extraordinary that he invited me to come back in March and do it again, which I did. So that I've actually been on Bill Moyers as a major interview twice since the last meeting we had in this room. And I think that's a testimony, both his invitation and the response that the program got, to the attractiveness of the kinds of ideas that I put out and that you hear, those of you that come regularly, every month. And that continues, and while I can't mention it, even though I'd enjoy doing it, I have another one in the offing where the audience is considerably larger than Mr. Moyers, and his is an enormous audience, but I will hopefully be able to tell you about that next month when we get together. But the interest in this kind of critical approach to the system, the economic system of the United States, has never in my lifetime been as profound, as big, and as sympathetic as I discover now. I think I've mentioned to you sometimes that I was active in the 1960s in college as a student. But the openness to what I have to say now is far beyond anything I ever encountered in my activity in the 1960s, both in terms of the sizes of the audiences and of their willingness to engage what it is I have to say. So whatever else the message tonight might convey to you in terms of things that are not so exciting and not so positive, I thought it might be good to start off with something positive. So let's begin, as we usually do, with some shorter updates about what has happened in the economy over recent months, 2 months since last we met, and then do a bit of an in-depth analysis of a couple of the bigger issues that are on the table. Okay, first, you will read in the newspapers fairly often about a recovery. And I want to talk to you about the economic recovery about which you occasionally see some reference. For example, the new Secretary of the Treasury in Europe this last week was telling the Europeans about our recovery, which is a very tactful thing to do since the Europeans are having a terrible time of it. Unemployment in Europe, the Eurozone last week, hit 12% as compared here to the United States, where it's about 7.8% last time I looked. So what about the recovery? Well, the answer, like most things, is depends on who you are. Some things have recovered, and others have not. What has recovered are bank profits. They've recovered. Large corporate profits. They've recovered. The stock market, where you can get pieces of recovered profits of corporations, has recovered with them. So all the way back to what it was before? No, but most of the way back. And so you can genuinely talk about a recovery for profits and for the stock market. But for the mass of the American people, there is absolutely nothing remotely like a recovery. And I'll just give you 3 specific examples. 1, the official unemployment rate is 7.7, 7.8%. Before the crisis began, the average unemployment rate in 2007, before it hit, was a little around 4.8%. It zoomed up to 10% in the worst months of 2009 and 10. And so it's now back to 7.8%. That's not halfway back to where it was before this crisis hit. That's not a recovery of unemployment. Second, about this same fact, is that most of the cutting of unemployment rate was not because people got jobs, but because of the way the number is calculated. Unemployment is the percentage of people in the labor force who have no job. If you stop looking for a job in the United States, you're no longer considered in the labor force. And the single most impressive statistic of this crisis so far has been the millions of Americans who've dropped out of the labor force. That's why the rate isn't higher than it would be otherwise. It's not because people have gotten jobs, it's because the number of people no longer counted has increased as people have quit from being in the labor force. The second statistic I thought I'd give you about who isn't participating in the recovery comes from the food stamp program here in the United States. Gets a lot of attention from right-wingers, so I thought I'd tell you about it myself. We don't call it food stamps anymore. The folks in Washington get very nervous if something stays for very long, so they change the name and the initials. It's now called the SNAP program, as in snap, crackle, and pop. SNAP stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps. And I thought a couple of statistics about our recovery. In 2008, the first year that this crisis really hit, the number of Americans getting SNAP, 28.2 million. 28.2 million. As of December 2012, the number of people getting SNAP support, 47.8 million. That is a staggering increase, and the line looks like a straight-up rocket line in terms of the number of people. More about the SNAP program. The right wing also likes to suggest that it's some sort of waste of money, some sort of largesse, some sort of extravaganza of helping people who don't really need it. So I looked into it. In 2013, this year, the average SNAP benefits for a qualifying household of 4, in other words, if you can show you're poor enough to be eligible and you have a house of 4 people, the average SNAP benefit will be $508 a month. So I worked that out. I divided 508 by 4. We learn in economics to do that kind of mathematics. And it comes out to $4.23 a day per person. There's real largesse. You can get 2/3 of a latte during the day with that amount of money. That's what we give the largesse. I'm going to come back to the notion of overindulgent social programs when I talk about, and then we should have a moment of silence, of course, Margaret Thatcher, who had a lot to say about those programs. The last statistic I thought would interest you also, and one you might not have heard of, is a product of the Pew Research, P-E-W, not about anything aromatic, the Pew Research Center's documentation of an interesting statistic. They put together unemployment, how many people are unemployed, with how much money, liquid assets, these people have to fall back on, because when you're unemployed and you lose whatever your regular income is and you have to live on an unemployment check, you begin pretty soon to have to draw on whatever liquid assets. And by liquid assets, they mean savings account, retirement account, home equity, stocks and bonds. So what was it? Well, they compared white and black families, and they compared to their situation in 1999, when there was no crisis, to 2009, the latest statistics for which they have numbers. And here's what they discovered. If you were employed over that time, the amount of liquid assets you had on average went up. Not big surprise. In other words, you were able to save a little. If you were unemployed, your liquid assets went nowhere if you were white. If you were black, you didn't have very many liquid assets. Let me give you the numbers. Average liquid asset, median. The median means we're talking about the number, half of the population is better off than this and the other half is worse off. So it's the midpoint. The median liquid assets for white households who had not suffered unemployment in 2009 was $10,000 in the United States. Let me make sure you all get that. Half the people in this country, white, who weren't unemployed at any time, have the enormous sum of $10,000 for greeting their retirement years. If you suffered unemployment over the 10-year period at some time between 1999 and 2009, your liquid assets, median, half the people were worse than this, $4,000 if you were white. If you were black and you didn't have any unemployment, your median income was $1,200. And if you were black and you had unemployment, your median liquid assets were zero. You had nothing. Now try to imagine what unemployment means to people with this kind of fallback. Then you'll understand that unemployment isn't just something about not having a job, but will hit people very differently depending on what kind of liquid assets they do or do not have. And the longer the unemployment lasts, of course, the more crucial whatever backup you have, and obviously whatever backup you don't have. So the recovery for these people that I'm describing, and these are the vast majority of Americans, there is no recovery. The only recovery they see is the one referred to by their political leaders, their business leaders, and the media. And no one should be fooled. Next, we have in the United States an austerity program. You read about it in the newspaper, you would think that's something that happens in Europe. You know, like long leisurely dinners, or really good wine with the dinner, or chateaus, or churches that are spectacular. Well, austerity is a phenomenon in Europe, we're going to come back to that, but it is also here. And we have a doozy going as of 2013. What is austerity again? Very simple. It's when the government decides that the way to cope with the crisis that we all see around us, the economic crisis, is by raising taxes and cutting government spending. Because the argument is, we look around and we see crisis everywhere, but that's not the key problem. The key problem is the government has an imbalanced budget. That's the key problem. So we must solve the key problem, which is the government's budget. So we should give the government more income, raise taxes, and less things to spend on, because then it won't have to borrow it, because it'll be in better shape. The policy to improve the balance of the government's budget is called austerity. Why does it have that name? Because in Europe, it's crystal clear what it means. The mass of people who are in the 6th year of a crisis are going to be asked to pay more in taxes, which they can't do. At the same time, the government services that they rely on more than ever are going to be reduced. It's called a 1-2 punch. And if you're not very strong, you keel over. And that's considered an austerity program in Europe. In the United States, we do exactly the same thing, as I'm going to explain it to you, but it is not called austerity. It is called fiscal responsibility, because it sounds much better. But it is the same policy. Let me explain. On January 1 of this year, the United States government, by agreement of Republicans and Democrats, of the President and the Congress, imposed a massive increase in taxes on middle and lower income people. That's what happened as of January 1. It was called an increase in the payroll tax. It went from 4.2% of your weekly check up to 6.2% of your weekly check. That's an increase of almost 50%. For a person earning $50,000 a year, it was another $1,000 taken out of your salary for that year. That's a lot. That's a lot. That was a tax increase on middle and lower income. Why do I say that? Because everybody pays the exact same rate, 6.2% this year, on the first $113,000 you earn. So if you earn $113,000, 6.2% of that is taken from you. Every dollar you earn above $113,000, if you're a rich person, every dollar above $113,000 has no payroll tax on it. Therefore, it is a tax that favors rich people. The richer you are, the larger the portion of your income not subject to the payroll tax, and therefore not subject to its increase. So this is a tax that is designed to hit middle and lower income people. This came as a compromise between the Republican and Democratic parties, whose candidates for president, Romney and Obama, spent half their time during the election talking about the need to protect, help, and support the middle class. After the election was over, they show what that means, using one of the central fingers on their hand to make the point. Okay? The only interesting thing is the number of people, and obviously I will not embarrass anyone, don't worry, the number of people who don't know what I just said, who aren't aware of what I just said. The newspapers were full of a fake theater, which is mostly what we get from Washington anyway. Here was the theater. On the one hand, President Obama. I am going to tax the rich. I insist on taxing the rich. On the other hand, the Republicans. You mustn't tax the rich. They are job creators. Back and forth, back and forth. There was no tax on the rich. When finally Obama won and got a tax on the rich, what exactly did he get? He raised the top rate of the income tax on couples, married couples, earning $450,000 a year or more. Everybody earning less than that, which includes a good portion of you, I would guess, are not affected by this. This is a tax only goes on the rich people who earn $450,000 or more. And what is it? Their tax on the first $450,000 isn't changed. No increase for them there. Only on the part above $450,000, where the rate was raised, hold on to your hats now, this is going to shock you, from 35%, which is what it was in 2012, to 39.6%. If we had time, I'd stop and I'd play you the national anthem. What a profound change. That'll make every rich person continue to be rich. It's trivial. How much money does it raise? $30 billion. How much does the payroll tax increase raise? $120 billion. Who's fooling whom here? We didn't have a tax on the rich, and we didn't have a serious debate about it either. We had play acting. while the real business was being done, which was imposing a heavy tax on middle and lower income people. That's what we did as of January 1. And what does it do for the economy? It's a disaster, because it means millions, 150 million Americans who now have less money to spend because their payroll tax went up, will be able to buy fewer goods and services. And with fewer goods and services that they can buy, there'll be fewer jobs producing those goods and services, so the unemployment will get worse. Wow. Was that all? No, remember I said austerity has two parts: cutting back government spending. That didn't happen January 1. They couldn't agree on that. So it happened March 1. You had to wait 2 months. On March 1, the cut in the government spending went through. And again, we couldn't say, we are going to savage all the government programs. That doesn't sound good. Or, we're going to impose austerity on the government. We had to come up with a term that would make everyone scratch their head and go, what? So we called it the sequester. And again, I won't embarrass anyone here by saying, what? Yes, the sequester. And the newspaper, journalists constantly write, or wrote, it's a little bit passé now, wrote about it, and about half the time what they wrote was complete fabrication. They must have made it up after one too many mint juleps or whatever it is they drink, because they didn't know, which I understand, since there's no economic textbooks I have ever read in which you can find an index entry sequester. Not available. It took imagination, and they have that in Washington, to come up with this. So what is this sequester? It's an across-the-board cut in government spending. Defense spending, welfare spending, highway spending, you name it. Now, this is important because the United States federal government is the largest single buyer of goods and services in the United States. If the federal government cuts its spending, that's a lot less goods and services that are going to be purchased by the government. And if the government buys fewer goods and services, there's less need for jobs for people to produce the goods and services. So between the payroll tax increase on January 1 and the sequester on March 1st, we have hit our bumbling economy a good 1-2 punch. And over the next few months, you will watch as the economic statistics look terrible again, for no surprise at all. We've just done what the Europeans have done. And with any luck, we'll catch up to the unemployment they've achieved. Okay. One last thing. If the rumors from Washington are correct, President Obama will announce probably tomorrow, so you can check your newspaper, some proposals for compromise with the Republicans. If there's one thing worse than the fake theater that Republicans and Democrats enact for us, it's when you hear that they've reached a compromise, because then we're in real trouble. And the compromise tomorrow, likely to be announced because it's been leaked now for days, is that the president is going to propose to the Republicans a cut in Social Security payments to older Americans. A huge portion of our people depend on the Social Security, older folks, on the Social Security they get. Not for all of their income, heaven help them, but for a good portion of it. So this is a significant thing. And it's going to be disguised again. It's going to be called switching to a chained cola system. There's not a drink. It's a chained cola system. I don't have the time, but it's basically a different way of calculating what has happened to the cost of living. Under Social Security, you're supposed to get an adjustment of your check to take account of rising prices. So depending on how you measure rising prices, your adjustment will be big or small. You'll never guess what their plan is: to change the method of adjustment so that you get a smaller one. In other words, it's a way of cutting Social Security. Please notice, Social Security was, once upon a time, sacrosanct. You couldn't touch it. Too many Americans who are older depended on it, and too many of their children depended on the help from the government for the help they were giving their parents anyway.
Related to this, today's story, today's time, you know Peter Orszag?
Yes?
He reported that CBO said the chain is winding up being no different than the regular method.
Yeah.
What the hell is that all about?
Well, because once you do a chain, all the chain does is it adjusts the index for the amount that the average American is spending. The idea being, if, for example, the price of fish goes up a lot relative to meat, a lot of Americans are going to shift from fish to meat because they can't afford the fish. So what do you measure? The amount of fish they used to have by the higher price, or the now new smaller amount of fish Americans eat on average, and multiply that by the higher price? If you use the second, your adjustment is small. If you use the first, your adjustment is large. You're guessing as to how much Americans will stop buying something whose price goes up. Nobody knows. It's an estimate that economists make. So you can guess that in the end, it won't make a lot of difference. That guess is exactly as good as any other guess. The whole point and purpose is to save money on Social Security. So if it were to work out that the chain doesn't get that result, they'll find another way, okay? Just so you know, and I don't have enough time, are there other problems with Social Security? No. Social Security is an extraordinarily well-funded economic system. For the last 30 and at least years, the amount of money being paid into Social Security by workers having money withheld far exceeds the amount paid out to old people entitled to get it. So they have accumulated a surplus. By the way, what does the Social Security system do with the surplus it collects from the American working people? It lends it to the United States government. Let me do that again. You pay more for Social Security than it costs to take care of all the old people who deserve it. And the government says, great. We can claim that we didn't raise your taxes this year. Your income tax is just the same. And how is that possible? Because we're ripping you off on the Social Security payroll tax. There's no problem. The fund is enormous with the debts of the Treasury back to the Social Security system. There's nothing wrong with our Social Security system. The notion that there's a crisis, we must do something, is 100% fabricated to justify an agenda which says, cut spending of government. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Okay. Third short topic, and I got to go a little faster, otherwise there won't be any time for the bigger topics. Third topic. Mrs. Thatcher died. Yesterday, she died. And she was the first and only, I believe, prime minister in England during the 1980s. Basically, that was when she was the prime minister. She is famous for fighting a tremendous battle with the 37 people and 4,000 sheep on the Falkland Islands, a battle that she won. And that's one of her major achievements. And the other one is an important one, and that deserves some comment. And I want to spend a few minutes on it as a way of honoring her historic role. And she is usually paired together with Ronald Reagan as sort of the Thatcher-Reagan era, again about the same time, 1980s and all the rest of it. And what did they do? Well, there's a lot of things we could say, but I want to focus on what I think are the crucial things. Both Reagan and Thatcher, during the 1980s, made decisions that were very significant. They decided to confront in an open and explicit way the received wisdom of how to govern a country, what kind of a capitalism to have. In the United States, that was called New Deal capitalism. sometimes called social welfare capitalism or welfare state, a lot of terms. But it's basically the idea that a capitalist society should provide lots of social programs that are given to people either equally across the population or according to their needs. In a sense, the government would redistribute wealth and income to make it less unequal than a capitalism left to itself would likely make it. That was considered necessary. It was considered necessary in Britain, and it was considered necessary in the United States. That came out of the Great Depression, when a private capitalism without much state support collapsed and revealed to everyone its unbearability. And in response, whether you follow the thinking of John Maynard Keynes in England, the economist who rationalized it all, or whether you just did it as a matter of feeling for all those miserable people in the Great Depression, governments came out of the Great Depression committed to doing for their people. Like we in the United States created the Social Security system. We created the unemployment compensation system. We created the precedent of the government hiring millions of people to do socially useful things because the private sector couldn't hire them, and so on. Britain did the same. Then for the 30 or 40 years after the 1930s, through the 1970s, no politician dared question that. And that included the Republicans. Mr. Eisenhower or any of the other Republican presidents supported Social Security, increased Social Security, increased minimum wage, another invention of the 1930s, increased all of that. You couldn't run for office in either party and question any of that. Not publicly, at least. But over that 30 or 40 year period, in both countries, something crucial happened. First, the right wing and the business community didn't like it. They were against it. They didn't dare come out openly for it, but they picked at it. They picked at it. For example, in 1947 in this country, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act to take away from the trade unions many of the powers and positions they had won in the 1930s and into the early 40s. They lowered the income tax on the highest bracket way down. They shifted the burden of taxes. They cut social they weakened it. And that had a fascinating effect. For the mass of working people who created the social welfare state, let me remind you, the president who did it, Franklin Roosevelt, the most popular president in American history, re-elected 4 consecutive times. Never had that before. He's the one who pushed it through because below him, the CIO, the socialists, and the communists were a real threat and forced these things. The business community didn't like that and went to work to demonize the communists, to demonize the socialists, and to weaken the labor movement. And they worked at it relentlessly. So that by the 1970s, the mass base of the support for social welfare in England and America alike had become disillusioned, disappointed, frustrated. They thought they were at the beginning of a real welfare system that would take care of them, that would give them a solid job. But it wasn't working out that way. The Democratic Party and the union leaders seemed unable or unwilling to fight to hold on to what they had gotten in the 30s, let alone build on it. So the support for the left, the support for social welfare, the support for social democracy, whatever phrase you use, was getting weaker and weaker in the 50s and then the 60s and the 70s. Here come then Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan. Mrs. Thatcher, the wife of a conservative businessman, and Mr. Reagan, an actor best known for playing a supporting role to a monkey in his film. What was the name of that? Gonzo? Was it? Bedtime for Bonzo. What? I don't need to say anything. It's enough. In any case, these two characters came at the right time. And here's what they did that made them important. They stood up and they said, We're against all of this. This is no good. This whole welfare system is rotten and bad, and nobody should do it. And you're all right, you working class people, to be disappointed because you should drop it, get out from under. The solution to your problem of a good job and a secure job, the things you wanted, isn't these Democrats who kept promising it and didn't deliver it. It's we who are going to do it. We're going to create for you a better chance than those people. That was a remarkable thing to do. It was feared by all the business leaders and the rich in both countries that you couldn't do that. That would bring a blowback, a reaction of the American people or the British people that would drown you in political loss. So it was daring in its way. They pushed harder. And to everyone's surprise, even theirs, they got no pushback. The left in America and the left in England proved to be a paper tiger, not a real one. The unions couldn't mobilize to do much about it. You remember here in the United States, the first act of Ronald Reagan was to fire all the air traffic controllers that had gone on strike. And what did the labor movement do? A lot wringing of hands, a lot of announcement of nothing. I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. And the same in England. So it taught the right wing.
There was a minor strike in 84, 85.
There was a minor strike. There were efforts to do something. Then there were some struggles in this country as well. But the fear that there would be a massive reaction to prove that this was an impossible politics never happened. And the right wing, the business community, and the wealthy began to discover what they then discovered in the next 30 to 40 years. You can push a great deal of the social welfare state back. Undo it. Undo the New Deal. Deregulate things. Privatize what had been a public service or a public production system. You could do things. In England, you can even attack the National Health Service, their socialized medicine. And as we will see tomorrow, in the United States, you can attack Social Security. Right on, right in the face. Wow. As a Democrat, let alone a Republican. So they deserve the credit, the two of them. For whatever reason, they felt they could become explicitly anti-social welfare state, and they proved that you could, and that it was a successful politics. And the second thing Reagan and Thatcher deserve our understanding, and this is not a question whether you like or don't like them, I mean, who cares? The second thing is they articulated an ideology to make it reasonable. In other words, they didn't just do it, but they said something to make it seem appropriate. And what was it? Basically, what Thatcher said, and she was more articulate than Reagan in these things, what she said was, of course, what all the people want is a good job and a good income from the job. And it follows that the way you get a good job and good income is you have to create the conditions so that the employers can offer you a good job and a good income. And the employers are saying that in order for them to do that, you got to give them more money, and you got to give them more profits to be earned from the money, and so give them less regulations to waste money on, and less rules that impede their profitability. And the more you make it profitable for them, the more jobs. That's the way to go. So it's reasonable for me to take away from the mass of people and give to the rich, because that's the best thing for the mass of the people. Yes. Think about it. That's a very basic conservative ideology in the history of capitalism. It isn't, in fact, new, but she newly articulated it as a wow, what an idea. In other words, you say to the middle and the poor, I'm going to take your money, and it's the best thing that can happen for you. That they said it isn't interesting. That so many of the middle and the poor believed it is something we all have to think about. It's been a powerful, that's why you hear in this country the echo of Mrs. Thatcher. Rich people and corporations aren't rich people and corporations, they're job creators. And helping them helps to develop the jobs which we all want. Whereas helping the mass of people with government programs isn't job creating, it's actually creating moochers. It's a failed program. Echo Margaret Thatcher, Mitt Romney, captured in that meeting in Florida by that tape, explaining 47% of Americans live off of the government. The rest of us, the man with 250 million in the bank, the rest of us are the hard workers, the productive ones. We produce everything, and the government comes and takes it and does what with it? Doles it out to these people. And you know what? If we didn't give it to them, they'd have to discover their own capabilities. They'd have to stand up, and it would be the best thing that happened to them as well as America. They'd become self-standing people rather than living on a dole. Variation, basic message. We must take it away from the poor half because it's the best service we can render them. You believe that, you're captured. It is the modern equivalent of Adam Smith, who taught us if every man and woman pursues their own individual self-interest without regard for anyone else, we will all be led as if by an invisible hand to the best outcome for everybody. So, let me translate. If we say, screw everybody else, it's all for me, that's the best that can happen for everybody. What a wonderful ideology to justify your screwing everybody else. And if you believe that, then that's how you behave, that's how you act. And that's been very important for the survival of capitalism. Last point. A friend sent me a quote, literally an hour before tonight, saying that what he liked best was a quotation from Margaret Thatcher, which went as follows. The problem with socialism is that you soon run out of other people's money. This sort of stuff passes for wisdom in the United Kingdom, I guess, or at least among some folks. Problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money. I'm going to spend the rest of today talking to you about that part of the economic crisis in the United States and in the rest of the world that has to do with banks and banking. And the single best way to describe how the banks of the world brought us into this crisis was to show you, which I will, how the banks ran out of other people's money and collapsed capitalism. But this, as I'll show you, clearly never dawned on Mrs. Thatcher. So much for her wisdom. Two little things, and then we go into that. First, there was a sad strike here in the month of February, here in New York. The Amalgamated Transit Workers Union, Local 1181, school bus drivers, that I'm sure many of you are aware of. It lasted quite a while, and it didn't work out real well. The workers eventually had to go back. They have now had their pay cut from 20% on up, have lost all kinds of benefits. It's a real defeat for labor in that particular case and in the city as a whole. And there's been a lot of debate inside the union and in union circles about this, as defeats like this typically do. and lots of interesting developments, all of which are positive. I would like to add one, though, that hasn't been raised, but that I think ought to be raised as an emblem of where I think we can go. One of the things that hasn't yet come up, at least I haven't heard about it, so if I haven't heard about it and it has happened, my apologies, it's just my ignorance. But one of the things that hasn't been said is that there's another solution to those that have been debated, and that is to say goodbye to the private companies that run these bus services, and to say that what the city ought to do is go to the workers and say, we're going to cooperativize this. We're going to create a bus drivers workers cooperative. And we're going to run the buses, and the city will lease the buses to the workers themselves. And the enormous money they save in not having to pay for a top-heavy management and to pay profits and dividends to the shareholders of the companies and so forth, that money could be saved and made available to make a cheaper service, and the city would benefit and the workers would benefit, and the cost would be capitalists who can no longer make a profit off this activity. It is my hope that this kind of alternative will more regularly become part of the conversations in this. Last little one. The country of Portugal did something interesting. It taught us a little lesson this last week about the law. Portugal has a conservative government that is imposing an austerity on Portugal. In fact, the austerity is very bitter. And my guess is that over coming weeks and months, the way you heard about Greece and Cyprus and a lot of other countries, you're going to hear about Portugal as the opposition builds to their austerity. But the opposition to austerity got a boost from an unexpected place last week, the Supreme Court of Portugal. And here's what the Supreme Court decided in Portugal. That part of the austerity program involved the government saying, okay, we are going to save money. Remember, the government budget is the big issue. We're going to save money by cutting the salaries of government employees across the board. By the way, they've done that in Greece, and they've done that in Ireland, and they've done that in Spain, and so forth. And we're going to do that in Portugal. And the Supreme Court said, no, you're not. No, no, no. And why? Here comes a reasoning that'll really shake you. Because it discriminates against public employees vis-a-vis private employees. If the problem is the economy as a whole and you want to solve the problem, you can't whack one group of workers because they happen to be working in a government job as opposed to other workers who happen to be working in another job who happen not to be employed by the... No good. Everybody's or nobody's. Because that's a concept of, here goes, fairness. And so the Portuguese government is going to have to come up with something else, but they cannot whack their public employees. The United States government does not work under that limitation. Okay. Let me turn now to a concrete example of a general problem. This crisis was brought first and foremost into the modern world by banks, mainly large banks located in what are called money centers, New York, London, Paris, Rome, Tokyo, and so on. But it is actually smaller banks that are more revealing of what the problem was. And not only smaller banks, but especially smaller banks that are in smaller countries. And so since we last met here, one of these countries has fallen into the toilet and the swirling is carrying it away. The country I'm going to talk to you about briefly, as an example, is a little island in the middle of the Mediterranean called Cyprus. And some of you, I'm sure, noticed it's been in the newspapers. Cyprus. Let me tell you about Cyprus. It is a beautiful place. Palm trees, exquisite beaches. It is really like the Greek islands because it kind of is a Greek island, even though it's an independent country. Most of it is populated by Greek people, but a portion in the north by Turkish people, and they don't get along real well. And they sort of have separate sovereignties, okay? But the island is majority, overwhelmingly majority, Greek. about 1 million people. Numbers are variable, but about 1 million people. And they have, proudly, 3 industries. Industry number 1, tourism. Tourism. That means Greek restaurants, hotels by the beach, all of that. Okay? That's a very dangerous business to be in. The problem is that it's very flaky because if economic conditions go bad, tourists don't come. And even if economic conditions don't go bad, there's always another place opening a new resort fancier than yours in the next island or the next continent or the next beach or wherever. So you never know quite where you are. It is the most precarious industry imaginable. But that's one of theirs, because they have the blessings of their climate. The second industry is a small shipping industry, which is not surprising because they're a little island right in the middle of the Mediterranean, and they've always had some shipping. That's 2 out of 3. What's the third industry? The third industry is many, many times larger than the 2 other ones combined. It's called finance. And if you didn't know better, you'd actually take that seriously, what I just said. An industry. What does that mean? It means banks, and banks surrounded by an army of accountants and lawyers and clerks and financial managers, whatever that is, lots of them. That's a big industry there. To give you an idea of how big, Cyprus's banks had on deposit a quantity of money equal to 6 times the annual output of goods and services of the entire country. That's crazy. They had more money in the banks than the economy ever needs or uses, by a factor of many. What the heck is going on? Well, Cyprus discovered what many other countries have discovered. Ireland is such a country. Iceland is such a country. Switzerland is such a country. And the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands and Liechtenstein. I could go on all night. A lot of countries have discovered the joys of finance. They have a big financial sector. And if you read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, they talk about the financial sector. So I'm actually going to tell you what the financial sector is, so that you are not fooled anymore. Okay, I'm going to use this as a bit of a help. The center of the financial system is the bank. And banks get money 3 ways. This is not complicated. Number 1, investors. They take money and buy shares of a bank or put money into a bank because they want to make money by what the bank does. The bank can make profits, and they want a piece of it. So they put some money into the bank to get a piece of the rest of what the bank does. The second way a bank gets money is by borrowing it. An investor puts it in to be an owner of the bank. A creditor simply lends money to the bank and has to be paid interest and have that money paid back. And the third way a bank gets money is from depositors. The people who put money in the bank for, you'll love this, safekeeping. You have to appreciate this, given where we're going with this. Businesses and individuals put money in the bank. I dare say many of you do. And by the end of the evening, you're going to be worried about it. There's no way out of that. So that's how banks get money. Not complicated. Investors give them money, creditors give them money, and you, depositors, give them money. So now the bank has all the money. What does the bank do with the money? Mostly it lends it out. It lends it out. It makes loans to governments. That's how governments borrow most of the money that they use. The deficits of government are paid for by borrowing mostly from banks. They also lend to businesses for whatever the businesses want, and they lend to individuals for you to buy a home, for your credit card, whatever. That's it. That's it. You got it? That's banking. Not complicated. Here's the deal. They want to make more money when they loan, the interest they get from loaning to all of them. They want that to be more than it costs them to pay off their creditors, pay back the loan with interest. More than it costs them to send you the monthly statement about your deposit. And then something left over to make a profit for their investors. That's it. That's it. That's it. Why then was Cyprus interested in developing a huge banking sector? And more important, why were they able to? What the hell was going on? Why would all these people, way more than the total population of Cyprus, be pouring money, and most of them were depositors, by the way, pouring money into deposits in Cyprus? Answer: Cyprus wanted it, and Cyprus made it worth their while. Here's what the Cyprus banks did. They said to the world, anybody listening, if you come and put your deposit here, we're going to give you a very nice interest rate, like 4 or 5%. You can't get that in your own country, can you? No. You all know what you're going to get if you make a deposit at your local bank here? You're going to get a lollipop. Maybe 2. You're not going to get anything. And the Cyprus bank says to you, I'll give you 4%, I'll give you 5%. Number one. Number two, I will never ask you an embarrassing question ever about how you come into the bank with money. You want to come in with 3 large suitcases full of money? No problem. You want it to be in, I don't know, Russian rubles? Sure. We'll convert it into euros. Cyprus is part of the euro system, so their currency is the euro. No questions asked. We will not require documents. We will not, nothing. And you can then write checks all you want with euros. You can pay your bills in euros, which everybody accepts. Nobody accepts Russian rubles except for a few people, and you don't want to do business with them anyway. So they offered these wonderful 2 things, a high rate of return and no questions asked. Why is that important? Because the world is now awash in vast quantities of money. And the reason is, in all societies, China, Russia, America, Britain, Brazil, the gap between rich and poor has gotten much, much worse. Huge quantities of money are collecting as the liquid form of wealth in relatively few hands, meaning that those few people all have the same problem. I got a lot of money, and I'm surrounded by people who don't. And they're looking at me funny. And I'm not calm. I'm not going to get stuck, because that funny look could pretty soon have a machete in its hand. So I need to be very careful and move my money out of wherever I am to a place that is safe. And if I can find one in a dollar area or a euro area, which is much safer than the country I come from, great. And if I can get a good rate of interest, better than anyone, even better. Guess what? I just discovered this little funny country in the Mediterranean, Cyprus. Perfect. I'm going to bring my money there. Let's assume it's legal money of a wealthy company. No problem. It's legal money of a wealthy individual. No problem. But now let's go another step. It's drug money. It's money that a cartel has to collect because they're selling huge amounts of heroin and they have airplanes to pay. They have a huge budget. They can't go to a regular bank and deliver suitcases of money because the regular bank, look at them funny. There are laws in a lot of countries, including this one, against money laundering, which is what this is. But they can go to Cyprus, set up an account, move the money in there, leave it a couple of months, and then send a draft to the Bank of America in New York City and establish the account that'll pay for the airplane that flies from Peterborough over to Guatemala to pick up you know what. That's how this is done. So they take that money. What did Cyprus have to lose here? Nothing. It's all kind of wonderful. If they did this right, billions of dollars would come to Cyprus, which no other way on earth would have happened. But people would find it, they'd put tons of money in Cyprus. And the banks in Cyprus would be able to make loans all over the place. Make big fees on the loans. Make loans to local people in Cyprus. Cyprus, a poor backward country with nothing, had a higher than average income for all of Europe. They were better off. Why? Because they were floating on this sea of money. It wasn't the tourism, and it wasn't the afternoon ouzo drink. It was banking. The only problem for for Cyprus, was the Cayman Islands. That's where I was going. And Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, and the British Virgin Islands, and all the others. Because they're all doing it. Because there's so much money around. So they have to compete. How can Cyprus offer 5%? It has to. Because if they didn't offer 5%, and the Cayman Islands did, the money would leave. In the stroke of a key, it would be gone from Cyprus and into the Caymans, or into Switzerland, or into. So it's a desperate struggle, not only for these banks, but for the countries. Because with all the money coming into Cyprus, little fees had to be paid to the government. Every time you set up a little phony company. Oh, I forgot to tell you about that. A phony company. You have to set up a phony. Why? Let me give you an example. You're a company that makes zippers in Bristol, England. It's a fanciful idea. They don't do that. But make zippers. And suppose the zipper costs $1, and you sell it all over Europe for $2. You make a nice profit. But if you do that, the profit shows up, $1 profit per zipper, cost of $1, sell it for $2. It shows up in England. You got to pay a high corporate income tax in England. Here's what you do. You set up the Anglo-Cyprus Zipper Corporation with one part-time employee in an office right next to the bank in Nicosia. There are, by the way, buildings around the bank full of offices into which nobody ever goes. You can visit. They're in all. Cayman has that. They all have that. Okay? So now you have the Anglo-Cypriot Zipper Company. Here's what happens. The British company makes the zipper for $1. Okay? And sells it to its own subsidiary in Nicosia, Cyprus for $1.10. This is just on paper, an invoice. The Nicosia Anglo-Cypriot Zipper Company then sells the same zipper to whoever they were selling it to before for $2. Now watch what happens. The English profit is only the difference between the $1 cost in Britain and the $1.10 price sold in Cyprus. So the profits for England are 10 cents. Meanwhile, the profit for the Nicosia company is enormous because they bought something for $1.10, which they sell for $2. They make 90 cents of the profit. Why is that attractive? Little detail I forgot. The corporate income tax rate in Cyprus, 0. Thereby, they just saved their corporate tax on 90 cents out of every dollar. The British Treasury is hobbled, and the company just saved 90% of its corporate income tax. In order to do that, you need an account in Cyprus and a little office in Cyprus, and you pay fees to the government to set up the Anglo-Cypriot Zipper Company. It's all a shell game designed to avoid taxes. Cyprus is wonderful for that. And so is Switzerland and Cayman Islands and the British Virgin, all of them. They're struggling and fighting all the time. So guess what? It's a struggle for these banks. But the countries support them because that's the best industry they got. They don't have this, they're poor, very poor again. So they're desperate. But in order to offer high interest rate, they've got to take risky loans to get high returns. And here's what the Cypriots did. But it could be done by anybody, and has been. The Cypriots said, the Greek government, back in 2010, was having a lot of problems, you may remember. And when they had a lot of problems, the value of their bonds went down, because nobody believed the Greek government could ever pay back. So you could get a $1,000 bond from the Greek government, and you could get it for $400. If they ever paid that back, my God, you would have paid $400, you get back $1,000. Who cares what the interest is? Whoa. And the Cypriot banks saw a chance to make a real killing. They bought lots of Greek government bonds, and a year later, the Greek government said, we're not paying them back. Careful, this is a normal bank risk. What did it mean? It meant that all the money that went into the bank was lent out, but now the part lent to the Greek government, like the part lent to some of the resorts in Cyprus, which nobody was going to anymore, and the shipping that nobody was leasing anymore, they couldn't get the money back. And when they couldn't get the money back from the people they'd lent it to, always a risk in banking, but a hyped risk when everybody's struggling to make it in the boom years of the 1990s and early part of the century. When they couldn't get the money back, they had to, like all banks, they had to do one of two things. They either had to go to the investors, the creditors, and the depositors and say, we're terribly sorry, but, to quote Margaret Thatcher, your money we just ran out of. We're terribly sorry. Have an ouzo on us, except you'll have to pay. Because we don't have anything. No bank wants to do that because that's declaring, effectively, bankruptcy. Moreover, the banks called in the government, friends of theirs, and said, have we got news for you? We're about to go kaput. And when we do, so do you. The people will lose their jobs, they will be miserable, and they'll vote you out of office. A few weeks ago in Cyprus was an election. The government in Cyprus, by the way, previously elected, was a government of the Cypriot Communist Party. Because the Communist Party was the government in Cyprus, you didn't hear anything about Cyprus. But it was governed by a Communist Party. It was pushed out of office. The government now is a conservative government. So these bankers went to the conservative government, their friends, and said, we're about to collapse everything. You've got to save us. Why am I telling you this story? Because Chase Manhattan and Morgan Stanley did exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. One more time. Exactly the same thing. But it's easier to see in Cyprus. So they said to the government, we're all going down. Why? Because we as bankers, this is crucial for you to get. We as bankers took our job and we really failed at it. We invested other people's money badly. We took a risk we shouldn't have, and we lost everything. Only everything is your money. Margaret Thatcher didn't have that in her mind. It's socialism when you run out of other people's money. What? I just described to you the banks ran out of other people's money. They failed. And then they threatened to take the whole society down with them. A credible threat in Cyprus. And a credible threat in New York in the autumn of 2008. Same problem. Same problem. So the government said, oh my God, we got to do something. And so what the government did is it turned to Europe. After all, they're a little country. Their GDP is $17 billion. Not much. They said to the International Monetary Fund and the European Union and the European Central Bank, help us, bail us out. After all, we're a little country, it ain't much. $17 billion will be a nice start, please. And hurry. Because what? Because the investors were beginning to smell that this was going on. Nobody said anything. And the creditors were beginning to smell what was going on. And the depositors were beginning to smell. And when depositors smell a failure of a bank, they tend to realize, uh-oh, there's not enough money in the bank to give us all what we are entitled to get back all that we've deposited. So we better run over there quick and get it first before it runs out. That's called a run on the bank. Means that literally they run there, hoping to get their deposits back before there is no more money. So the bank's terrible fear is that that process begins, because then the jig is up and they have to pay. They have to pay because they don't have the money. So they went to the European, and the Europeans had meetings with them. The great experts had meetings, very complicated. It has to be done secretly with highly specialized experts, because much too complicated for the rest of us. And here's what they came up with. We, the Europeans, will help you, because we are all Europeans. There was a moment of deep emotion. It lasted 13, maybe 14 seconds. Then the hard bargaining began. Okay, we're going to give you roughly 10 billion. But it can't give you more because it's clear you could never pay. We're giving you 10. Your annual output is 17. If you owe us another 10, you're already in debt. You'll never pay back. Who are we fooling? So you're going to have to come up with the other 7. We'll give you 10, but we won't give you 7. You have to come up with the other 7. But we have, our economy is gone, everything's gone, we have nothing. No, you do have something. You do have something. You have something. In your bank are deposits. Lots of them. Yes, of course. But the deposits are insured. We have a law that says everybody who has under 100,000 euros, about 130,000 bucks, is guaranteed that no one can pay. And we obviously can't take the money from the people who have more than that, because they're the people who make our finance industry what it is, without which we're gone, and which is what we're trying to avoid. Yes, we see your point. Next. You're going to have to, and overnight, about 3 weeks ago, on a Friday, the deal was done. And the Europeans and the leadership of the Cypriot government, both of whom denied what I'm about to tell you 2 days later, but it was very clear, the documents are all there, they agreed that they would, and this is really, if you get this, you get high finance, that they would go into the deposit accounts of all depositors in Cypriot banks. Every euro, over 100,000 euro, you would be taxed 10%. The government would simply come in and take it from you. And for everybody who had less than 100,000 euros, 6.25%. So you went to bed with an amount in your account on Friday night, it wouldn't be there Monday morning. You'd lose some. Now let me make sure you understand what happened. The government is taking your deposits. What is the government going to do? It's going to take the money from you, from your deposit, put it together with the money given by Europe. Remember the 10 billion from Europe plus the 7 billion taken from your deposits. And then the government is going to fix our economy. That mainly means recapitalize the banks. English means giving it to the banks so that they have the money with which to honor what? Their investors' desire for profits, their creditors' desire to be repaid, and their depositors' desires to have what is still left in their account returned to them. The government, faced with the failure of the bank to properly protect and use its depositors' money, is going to take the depositors' money to reimburse the bank for its failure. At this point, you have to stop and realize any system that could pull that off deserves to be in charge. You all have to think to yourself. You all have to think to yourselves, what kind of sucker buys this, permits this? By the way, to the credit of the Cypriot people, they went into the streets that weekend as it became clear what was going on, that they were going to, the depositors, who had nothing to do with the crisis, who weren't responsible for the failure of the resort business, who weren't responsible for the failure of the shipping business, and who for sure weren't responsible for the failure of the financial business, were being told, you're going to pay, you're going to lose the deposits you entrusted to the bank so that the government can take the money and give it to the bank that just screwed you over. How about that? Please salute the flag. Thank God for the government. The Cypriot people went into the streets. They did. And in about 24 hours, the Europeans withdrew from this plan. The Cypriots withdrew. Everybody pointed the finger at some. The Europeans said it was the Cypriots' idea. The Cypriots, no, the European, over. They didn't know what to do. The banks couldn't function, had no money. So they did what all honest people do when the banks can't give you any money. They closed the banks. For the next 10 days, all banks were shut. Each day they said it's for 1 day or for 2 days. 10 days it was. You could get money out of ATM, but it was limited. I think 100 euros a day, crippling the economy there because nobody could do business on 100 euros a day. So what did they do? They came up with a compromise. For people with less than 100,000 euros in the bank, your deposits will not be touched. For people over 100,000, oh boy, are we going to get you. The estimate now, 40 to 50%. Why? And here comes something that is really stunning and gives you an idea of the conditions we face. It turns out that a disproportionate number of the accounts over 100,000 euro were in the hands of Russians. That Russians, particularly Russians whose businesses are a little questionable in the legal department, which doesn't distinguish them from businesses in many other countries, but nonetheless, it was convenient to say these are Russian mobsters or something like that, and Russian community had developed in Cyprus, people who took their retirements there because they found it really interesting and so forth. These depositors, the biggest people who made Cyprus what it is, are being forced to pay the cost of the failures of the banks to whom they entrusted their money. Guess what? As fast as they can get their money out of there, they will. And it'll be a cold day in a hot place before wealthy people think of putting their money back in Cyprus, which means that Cyprus's financial industry is not looking real good. And since their resort business is not looking good and their shipping business isn't looking good, Cyprus is a disaster. And the Europeans and their own government together produced this disaster. But the disaster is, of course, bigger, and that's why I'm saying it to you. The same money laundering is done here in New York. Some of the biggest banks in New York have recently been paying hundreds of millions of dollars fines to the United States government because of money laundering. HSBC, Bank of America, Morgan, all of them, or nearly all of them. Money is sloshing around the world system because it isn't spread evenly among large numbers of people as it would be in a more egalitarian distribution of wealth. It is, in fact, congealed at the top in the hands of people who have the logic look always to safely to spread it and to find the best rate of return, provoking this kind of instability on a staggering scale. Let's do it on a human scale. The Cypriot people cannot look too much of a future. The students there cannot look to much of a job. They can't continue their education. The exodus of young people from Cyprus looking for work elsewhere is already underway. They can all see what's going on. This is a tragedy written in the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in that little island, and this story is replicated everywhere. A conclusion, then. What is going on that would permit a country like the United States, which did the same thing. The only difference in the United States was when all the big banks in 2008 could not collect on their loans because they had invested in those subprime mortgage securities that couldn't be paid off anymore, and all the rest of it, they, like the Cypriots, turned to the government. And the government bailed them out. But what the government didn't do yet was to take the money out of our deposit accounts. They took the money out of our taxes. And they took the money out of our Social Security. That's what they're doing. And they took the money out of social programs that they don't provide us anymore and used the money instead to bail out the banks that failed in their function in a capitalist system. Next time you hear someone say, capitalism has a built-in system, and if you do not succeed in your business, well, then you fail, and you must make way for someone else who's better at it. That is a story you tell to very old people and very young people. Nobody in between should believe that for 1 minute. That's right up there with Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer. You ought to outgrow that early. The bank's job is to collect money from those who have it to put in a bank and lend it to those who are doing useful things but who couldn't do them unless they had some money, which is the function of the bank to get into their hands. The bank is to be prudent and careful about lending other people's money. When the bank fails at it and then turns around to the society and says, let's see, I really failed at my function, so bail me out big time, and if you don't, I'm going to take you with me. To which the American people, like the Cypriot people, actually not with as much militance as the Cypriot, the American people say, okay, don't take too much, please. Wow. This gives strength to those who have new plans. And in the days after the Cypriot arrangement, Europeans and Americans were beginning to be asked by the clever reporters, the few of them that we have in the financial press, gee, is it legal in the United States too to take depositors' money when the banks they've deposited their money in have failed in order to bail those banks out with their depositors' money? And the answer, according to the FDIC in the United States, is yes, we can do that. We hope we won't need to. Oh, I told you I'd worry you. Why in the world do we permit? Come on, I mean, even the most elemental midget mentality would understand. If there's an institution that can so badly misfire that it threatens the entire economy, and then turn around and blackmail the people it has failed to give them the money to allow them to continue to be in a position to do that to the society, it's too much. How do you possibly allow this? The obvious solution, is you cannot let an institution so powerful socially be owned and operated by people whose focus is the private profit they make off of its function. That's nuts. If the society lives with the result, the society has to participate. The society has to benefit. The society has to make sure it's transparent. The society has to monitor what they're doing so they don't get into that situation. They've proven they're not reliable. They've proven the absurd, illogical irrationality of this system. What more could be wanted? Country after country. The United States, big, powerful. Cyprus, little. Small, weak, it's all the same. Iceland, same story. Ireland, same story. Spain, same story. On and on and on. Final point. Have there been people who have said in the face of this sort of story, and we're replicating what happened in the Great Depression, this isn't new. This is not new. Have there been people say, yeah, we do something? Yes. In France, for example, out of the Great Depression came the nationalization of the banks. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, all the major banks in France were government banks, run by the government, open as much as the government could be forced to get them open so that everybody could see. At least you had some social responsibility. So is that an option? Of course it is. But the genius of America, like the genius of Great Britain, the legacy of Thatcher and Reagan, is that that obvious alternative doesn't get mentioned, doesn't get debated, is swept under the rug like a bad smell, to be avoided, because polite people don't even talk like that. And it's doubly amazing in the United States, because in the United States we actually have, and I like to end on a positive note, we actually have a bank, yes we do, that is a public state bank, not private, owned and operated by the government. We have one. It is in an unlikely place, I admit that, and I'm going to tell you in a minute. It is in North Dakota. It's called the Bank of North Dakota. It is owned and operated by the state of North Dakota. Now, it was brought into existence back in 1919, almost 100 years ago, by a socialist populist mass movement in that part of the country. Yes, that's what they had then, and they established a bank. And that was because, ready, they hated the big bankers that try to dominate us, and for them it's the banks in Chicago and Minneapolis and those places that are near them. We want a people's bank. And at the very least, the government, the state, and every city and town, when it raises money from taxpayers, shouldn't be putting it in a private bank. Why should they make the money from the people's paying their public duties? We'll have our own bank. And we'll put the money that the people give to their government in that bank. And the money that the bank earns by lending that out, they'll have to lend it to people here in North Dakota, not someplace else. They're our bank, and they're going to provide money for little businesses and farms and all the things they have in North Dakota, assuming they have things in North Dakota. I've never been there, so I take this on faith. In 2000, I'm going to get in trouble with people in North Dakota. In 2011, the bank earned $70 million in profit, which it returned to the state of North Dakota to be used for their general fund. $70 million. That's a very small state. Has about 700,000 people in the state of North Dakota. So $70 million. They also have a rule. No loan can be made unless the recipient of the loan of a Bank of North Dakota can show that for every $100,000 worth of borrowing, at least one new job in North Dakota has been created. What an interesting idea. No such constraint operates on the Bank of America or the Citibank or Goldman Sachs or anybody else. So is a public bank an option? You betcha. Would it make sense given what I've told you? Of course. Fortunately, we don't do that. And because we don't, we allow the Cayman Islands, where Mitt Romney, remember, where he has a lot of money in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands and Liechtenstein and Luxembourg and Switzerland and Cyprus, maybe still a little. And who knows who else? Many, many others. By their being able to be there, of course, what do we get? We get a wonderful incentive for illegal economic activities because it's so easy to launder the money, so easy to hide it, so easy to move it. They're doing a wonderful service for the drug business, for human trafficking, for all the ways that money has to be cleansed, which is huge. Is that an argument about this? Not hear a word, not hear a word. Modern capitalist globalization produces all of this. To count the benefits and costs of capitalism would require you, if you weren't blind, to look at the disaster of Iceland, the disaster of Cyprus, the disaster here in the United States, where we are still unrecovered from a crisis in which these banks, playing by these rules, are able to get vast bailouts so that they continue to operate the way they did, as if they hadn't brought us to the worst catastrophe since the Great Depression. It really requires a level of blindness that you really cannot afford to let continue. Thank you very, very much.